All right. Hey, everybody, I'm Drew and I am an alcoholic, and I will screen share this and just a quick little background about myself. My name is Drew. I'm from Atlanta. I am my sobriety date is May 6th of 2008. I do have a sponsor. It is LJ from Virginia, and do sponsor other members of AA. I also am the current Area 16 Archives chair. So with all that out of the way, there is a lot of cool stuff that I'm going to try to share with you tonight. And again, I meant to do this last week, and apologies, but thank God Jim was able to fit in and had the time wrong, but with all that said and done, it's amazing. It is, it's convenient. I love the fact that you guys do Founders Week instead of Founders Day. And when we look at Founders Day, it's pretty much June 10th, 1935. And the way that I kind of am going to drive this concoction of presentations to try to show or at least highlight Founders Day. There's more than one date that is almost a milestone, and where I'm going to try to cover all of that. Now, when we're talking about Founders Day, we're pretty much talking about a handful of individuals. But first, I'd like to start out with a gentleman, one of our co-founders by the name of Bill Wilson, and of course, show exactly when his first drink was. And it was around 1918 when Bill had, quote unquote, discovered liquor. In fact, he actually had what is referred to as a Bronx cocktail at the Grinnell family mansion. And what's interesting is there's just a little note that was from to Bill W. Kind of documentary recently, and they showed this. This was a 1917 note that Bill had written to Lois, and of course it's labeled "Darling One" and "I love you, dear." And of course he goes on, but she had penciled in New Bedford summer 17 first drink and put a star asterisk. So I thought that was just an amazing thing. So that was Bill Wilson's first bit of alcohol. Now, to completely tell the story of how we went from there all the way to the founding of AA, and of course, a solution to this age-old riddle of alcoholics, especially hopeless alcoholics, finally being able to achieve sobriety for long periods of time. And long periods of time, mean a matter of months into years. And since the man started crushing grapes, there really hasn't been a solution. So, what we're looking at here is a couple of photographs of Lois, and, from the earliest 1913-14, when Bill first met Lois at Emerald Lake in north of East Dorset, Bill's hometown when he was a lad. He and Lois basically, spent the entire time together, especially, the entire dregs of this alcoholic downward spiral described as strained at times. But again, after the war and all the way up to when Bill's story began, they were together through it all. Now, from the beginning of Bill's story, especially the longer version of Pass It On, which is Bill's story in book form, his alcoholism progressed rapidly. In fact, it got worse. Now, when we're looking at Bill and his attempts to get sober, we're just going to run through all the times that he tried to get sober. His first attempt to stop drinking was willpower. That's stated clearly in his story. Then, after that failed, of course, because willpower doesn't mean anything, came his first hospital stay. And this was Bill's second attempt to stop drinking. This is when he did willpower with a side order of self-knowledge. And of course, we know how long that led, because that was basically the start of his second hospital stay. And during the second hospital stay, second attempt, Lois was actually given brochures for insane asylums, which Bill actually found later back at the house, kind of "Hey, honey, what's this all about?" And you can imagine what kind of conversation, how awkward that got. But what's really interesting is Bill actually describes the interaction that's Lois had with Dr. Silkworth at that time, and it was outlined in a document called That Strange Obsession. And we're basically going to look at a couple just quotes from that. This is Dr. Silkworth talking to Lois, and he basically says to Lois, "When Bill first came to this hospital 3 years ago, I felt he might be one of those rare cases who might recover. I hope that when he better understood himself and the nature of his illness, he might win out. In spite of his several severe relapses since then, I have gone on hoping. For as you say, he desperately wants to quit, and his will to do so is very great, but now I'm discouraged. I'm afraid he's going to be like nearly all the other alcoholics who come my way. And that's not a good thing." And he closes it out by basically saying the main problem is its obsessional nature, one of the most powerful compulsions known to man. How to expel the mental obsession is the problem. So all this was around the same the time of his second attempt at and second hospital stay at Towns Hospital. Now, after this one, again, it's described in Pass It On that after this relapse, terror, self-hatred, and suicidal thoughts became constant companions. And I hooked up with that. I was able to relate a lot to that. Now, after that, again, his was the start of his third attempt. And this is where it's described fear sobered him for a bit. And of course, that lasted for about 15 minutes. Then, of course, his drinking binge on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1934, and he was off to the races again. In fact, that was the trip out to the famed shooting range. Of course, when he returned, there's a great quote in Pass It On that also says, "The next morning about 5 a.m., Lois found Bill unconscious in the doorway of 182 Clinton Street. Bill fell against the wall or door and was bleeding heavily from a bad scalp wound. His hand still clutched the strap of the golf bag. As he regained consciousness, nothing much was said." And I like to add that I guarantee you that probably Lois had stepped over him at least once to come in and out. So again, and this is where this whole kind of story starts. This is the pre-start of Bill's fourth attempt. And of course, right now at this point in time, Bill knows the problem. He knows, doctor's opinion description of what alcoholism is. He knows the grave nature. He knows the obsession in the mind, and he knows, most importantly, the allergy of the body, which, once he starts drinking, it triggers that unusual, unstoppable craving for more alcohol. But that's all that Bill knows at that point in time. No solution and no way of tapping into it. So with all that in mind, again, in Bill's story, it talks about Bill's musing was interrupted by the telephone, and it was the cheery voice of an old school friend. And of course, his name was Ebby T. or Edwin Throckmorton Thatcher. And of course, it's described that this was an old school friend of his and from Burn Burton. In fact, we actually have a photograph of his senior year in Burn Burton. There's a couple of interesting photographs or faces that are on this particular photograph. We know that this was 1912, and first off, we have Bill and his high school sweetheart at the time, Bertha Bamford. But to give you, to put names to faces, there's Bill, there's Bertha Bamford, and of course, there's another one, and there is Ebby Thatcher is in this one as well, and there he is sitting right there. We're not sure why he is holding the shovel. But again, the joke would be is it's so he can continually dig his hole a little deeper. Just thought that was some humor. But again, this is all around this time frame, and what we're seeing here is Ebby in later days after his school, he worked for his father. In fact, his parents and all his relatives were pretty much well astute government officials. In fact, his grandfather, his uncle, even his brother were the sitting mayors of Albany. It was almost a dynasty. And of course, Ebby at this time frame, was starting to drink a little bit more. It's described that he mostly stayed in Albany. This was his family home. Right across the street from this and down to the right is basically City Hall. So this is a very literally downtown affluent, and this is where he was spending most of his time. And it's, just a couple of photographs of Ebby through the years. One catching, of course, fish and several others in his time frame. Now, he is described again his first drink. He started drinking around 19 years old in 1917, and it's quoted that he could walk into the Hotel Teniac bar in Albany and basically pick up a beer. And that's an actual picture of the bar from their own literature there at that hotel. But of course, Ebby's drinking progressed, and it became a problem. And this is just another interesting photograph of Ebby in the mix. It's pretty hard to see, but he's actually crouched down there in the corner. And I don't know about you, but the guy standing on the left looks like he may have, maybe the earth is spinning. We're not sure. But again, it kind of gives you an idea. Now, when Ebby was growing up, especially in this time frame with his brother being mayor, they basically said, Ebby, your drinking's getting in the way of the family, and you're starting to give our reputation a black eye. And so they basically send him up to their family cottage, which, well, kind of a cottage, is actually in Manchester, Vermont. So Ebby's went up there, and the first thing they told him to do was, of course, don't do anything, try not to drink, and definitely don't embarrass the family. Of course, you can imagine this whole entire thing. Ebby, you're damaging our reputation. You gotta go. But whatever you do, do not drink and do not get into trouble. And of course, the note there is, well, how did that work out? And in short, his first arrest slip was August 25th of 1934. It was for intoxication, and the cost was about $32 total, which is about $585 today. And of course, that wasn't enough. So his second arrest was September 28th of 19, I should say 34. When we inquired, they try to just, they show about the docket numbers. But what's interesting is if you look at September 28th and January 9th, and you do the math, again, that's about 90 days. So he was arrested on September 28th, but nolle prost is will not prosecute. Now, there's also another, and again, this was one of these was the one where he breaks out the family shotgun and is trying to paint the house. And the story is the sheriff showed up and said, Ebby, you can't be discharging a gun in city limits. And of course, Ebby's out there, like an anti-aircraft battery, just blowing up the neighborhood, and bad things happen. Now, he ends up getting arrested again twice in this short period of time, and none of these were him driving. There was another third offense that happened about a decade earlier than that in 25, but that's really not applicable. But so Ebby basically went with the sheriff. They put him up, and he's about to be committed to to the local puzzle factory for commitment. But when we're looking at this, again, this is just so happens that a certain American businessman by the name of Roland Hazard happened to be up in Manchester celebrating his own kind of bit of sobriety. In fact, he's celebrating 6 months. He was another hopeless alcoholic who joined something called the Oxford Group in New York, in spring of 1934. In fact, his daughter Caroline, who was a member through college, was the one that actually got her father involved at the Oxford Group. Now he joined, and he made his quote unquote surrender, what we refer to as the third step. So he gave his life and his will over to the care of God at that point. And of course, he joined and quit drinking and was celebrating this 6-month milestone at his family college in Bennington. And he was there with two other Oxford Group members, one person from New York who was accompanying him. His name was Francis Shep Cornell. And of course, he was kind of a stock guy as well as Bill. They shared that. Very active Oxford grouper. He and his wife will both be Oxford group speakers, but he is accompanying Roland in Manchester. The other one is a local. At this time, he is actually a state senator for Vermont, so he's local. His name is Stephen Seabrook Quackenbush Graves. There's a name for you, Quackenbush. So all these guys are up there. Now, at the time, again, he was a Vermont state senator and Oxford group supporter. He got his start in New York and Broadway. And of course, we're not sure how he went from Broadway to state senator, but and he pulled it off. And of course, there's an interesting photograph of him and his first wife, Caroline. Now, as this whole thing kind of unfolds, we're looking at these three men, right? Roland, Seabra, and Shep. They're all up there at his Roland's family cottage. In the synchronicity, Eddie is about to be sent to this Brattleboro State Mental Hospital for alcoholic insanity, and so they're thinking about what can they do. What is the Oxford principle at that time was, in order to keep it, you got to help somebody else. And of course, Seaver introduces the fact that this local prominent guy from Albany, New York, family's big in politics, is about to be sent to the puzzle factory for a short little stint. And of course, it just so happens that the Oxford group had something in order for him. Now, Seabra just so happens to hear about again that young man for the alcoholic insanity. And of course, it just so happens that Seabra's father was going to be the sitting Bennington judge presiding over Seabra's or Ebby's commitment. And so his name was Judge Collins Milner Graves. And of course, long story short, Seabra decided to talk to his father. And of course, they thought that, the Oxford group would have something for Ebby, and informed the judge that Ebby suffered from alcoholism, told them that there were a couple of visitors up in the area from New York. One was a past Rhode Island state senator by the name of Roland Hazard and Shep Cornell. And of course, they had something in the way of a possible means or a cure for young Ebby there. And of course, the judge decided, basically in a nutshell, take them. I don't care what you do with them, but don't let them get in any trouble and get them out of my state. And that's exactly what they did. The judge released Ebby to the care of Roland and Shep. They brought Ebby back to Roland's family cottage, and that's actually it. Yes, that is a cottage. It is a small little thing nestled up in Bennington, Vermont, which is about west of Manchester. Now, as soon as kind of the earth stops spinning for Ebby, right? He's detoxing a little bit. They actually move him to back to New York, and he stays with Shep Cornell for about 24 hours until there's an actual room here. And this was the Calvary Chapel and the Calvary Mission. And of course, this was on East 23rd Street in New York City. And of course, it's pretty interesting, but its location to Bellevue Hospital, the mental ward at Bellevue Hospital, is basically, you take a left from this angle and you walk to the end of the street, and Bellevue's right there. So it's pretty interesting. But when you look at it again, Calvary Mission was described as a 52-bed mission. Now, Ebby gets active with Roland Hazard and Shep Cornell. They start walking them through the tenets of the Oxford group. Again, they talk about these procedures. They introduce them to something called the four absolutes, which are honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And essentially, basically, what they do is they just pass on the solution, which is spiritual in nature, and they also pass on something called the practical program of action. And it's this practical program of action that is from the Oxford group. Now, as we look at it now, remember, Bill had the knowledge of the problem from Dr. Silkworth. So he had the obsession of the mind and the allergy of the body. But since talking with Ebby, again, his musing was interrupted by the phone of an old school friend and his interaction there. Ebby and all that entire kind of crew, whether it be Roland or Shep Cornell, they basically got him in touch with the other components. Of course, the solution, which is spiritual in nature, as well as this practical program of action. And, in that, basically that's steps 3 through 11. And if you look at it, it's basically the four absolutes, the surrender, the giving testimony, or fourth and fifth step, what we would call, all the way through 8 and 9, cleaning up, restitution, and of course this thing called quiet time in the morning, which is definitely step 11, but there's also step 10 that kind of steps with that. So the synchronicity. Again, Ebby brings these components to Bill Wilson, and at this particular point in time, Bill Wilson is the only person on earth that knows all three parts of the alcoholic puzzle. And he knows the problem from Dr. Soakworth. He knows the solution. He understands the powerlessness. He understands the power, which is essentially step 2, and how to tap into that power, which is basically steps 3 through 12. So in short, Bill is quite aware of this. Now, he's also introducing is through Calvary Church. We're going to talk about this gentleman. His name is Sam Schumacher. Now, when we hear of Sam Schumacher, basically his church runs Calvary Mission, as you see here. And of course, that's a 1926 poster for Calvary Mission when it first opened. Sam Schumacher was also kind of in charge of something called Calvary House, and that's pretty much the home base for the Oxford Group movement in New York at this time. And when we look at Calvary Church right here, again, he became rector of the church in 1925. He opened the mission in 1926, and then Calvary House opened in 1928. And of course, that's where this whole thing with Bill starting to get sober and things, falling into place, kind of take their path. Now, on Thursday night in the Calvary House, they had an Oxford group meeting. And of course, this was just behind the church overlooking Gramercy Park. Later, Bill and Lois began to attend meetings here when he starts getting sober. Now, there's a tiny little hitch, just a minor hangup on this solution. And of course, when Ebby approaches Bill, especially the "I've got religion" part on this, Bill kind of has this internal, I wouldn't say tennis match of God either is or isn't, but again, in the next few pages on Bill's story, he struggles with this concept of spirituality. And one of the things that really helps Bill understand this connection is in his story. He refers to the third time that Winchester Cathedral is mentioned. The first one is on the page 1 with the doggerel of an old tombstone. He talks briefly about it, and then eventually, later on, towards the end of his story, he talks about the Winchester Cathedral having a great impact on him. He remembered one experience that he felt, again, the apprehension that lay ahead. And again, this was World War I. So Bill thought he was, basically facing death. It was artillery. And when he went into Winchester Cathedral, something amazing happened there, but he could not understand it. And in short, it's really interesting because it describes it in passing on. It says, an epidemic kept Bill and his regiment detained at a camp near Winchester. Depressed, lonely, and apprehensive about what lay ahead, Bill went to visit Winchester Cathedral. Inside the great cathedral, the atmosphere impressed itself so deeply upon him that he was taken by a sort of ecstasy, moved and stirred by a tremendous sense of presence. He has been in many cathedrals since and has never experienced anything like it. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. And of course, there had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. And in that movement, I knew that everything was all right as it should be. And he describes that in page Pass It On. Again, when Bill's has this spiritual connection and, the connection being established, he remembers that during World War I, he was basically facing no man's land and a grim survival rate. And you know, he had surrendered and found this, got spiritual about it. And of course, now in his story, he's also achieving this hopeless alcoholism when he's talking with Ebby Thatcher in the now town's hospital. And of course, he has that surrender experience as well. In fact, Bill's trying to figure out his situation again. You know, Ebby is the most likely attempting to sober up Bill. Reference that Bill even made his way to Calvary Mission looking for Ebby. And it just so happened that there was a meeting. Bill got a plate of hot beans and some point. They opened the floor for testimony. Bill just couldn't wait to hear what he was going to say. Ebby attempted to stop him, but you can't interrupt the man on a mission. Later, Ebby remarked that Bill didn't do such a bad job. And that was pretty much one of Bill Wilson's final drinks of alcohol. Now, it just so happens that around that time frame, in Cincinnati, Ohio, there was an Oxford group house party, and some of the guests that were there were, of course, Mrs. Samuel Moore Schumacher. So Helen Schumacher was there. You had Francis Shep Cornell that was there. His wife was actually one of the guests of honor, and there's another interesting name that popped up, and her name was Mrs. Frederick Seiberling. So Henrietta Seiberling's mother-in-law was actually another Oxford group speaker there. And of course, Sam Schumacher was there. In fact, this is the Cincinnati Enquirer. This is December 8th of 1934. And there's Roland Hazard sitting right there. There's Mrs. Frances Shep Cornell. And of course, there is Reverend Samuel Moore Schumacher. And again, what makes this photograph unique is this is 3 days prior to Bill Wilson entering Towns Hospital on December 11th for the fourth and final time. So I thought that was a pretty interesting, little tidbit. In fact, this is Bill Wilson's sobriety slip and discharge. You can see there's a lot listed here. Number one, his name, William G. Wilson, and of course his age was 38. You can see his diagnosis, of course, is ALC, alcoholic. You can see that he was admitted on December 11th of 1934 at specifically 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon. So definitely a day drinker. In fact, one description even has him chugging a beer on the steps of Towns Hospital. We don't have any absolute documentation about that, but boy, is that a great story. So 2:30 in the afternoon, it makes sense. And of course, what's really fascinating is his discharge date was December 18th, where he stepped from the hospital a free man. There was an overall cost of $125, and that was about $2,334 in today's number. But what's really interesting is it also shows on this particular slip how many times he was there. In fact, if you look, it says relapses. It says page either 16 or 162 of book number 20. And then underneath that, it says +3 this book. And of course, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that this is page 65 of book 21. So when you do the math, there was 1 in book 20 and there's 3 in book 21. So that means 4 times in Towns Hospital. So pretty interesting. Again, just a quick little sidebar with working with others within the first 5 months. Again, with Ebby, traversing New York looking for folks to take. Within those 5 months, only 2 people stayed sober, Bill and Ebby. Now, descriptions of the amount of people that they worked with ranged anywhere between half a dozen in Bill's story to 92 to 78 to some 96 candidates. But what we do know is, again, Bill and Ebby were the only ones that were staying sober. But a couple of weeks after Bill was discharged on December 18th, what's really fascinating, again, getting busy working with others, one of the first people Bill works with, and this is referenced December 31st, 1934, when he was released on December 18th. And of course, there was an interesting note. One of the first people that he worked with was a guy by the name of Frederick E. Braithwaite. Now, when we look at this, this is an actual letter from Sam Schumacher to Bill Wilson dated January 22nd of 1935. And there's actually two people listed here. In fact, that letter says, I hope you realize the guidance you have, your having known Jim Williams previously. Jim Williams was a stock guy, as you understand you did in business. His wife, Margaret, is a full-time in the group, and he has held out for a long while. You may be just the person he cracks the show and brings him over. He drinks a lot and is desperately unhappy and inferior and needs what you have got for him. And he is very grateful for what he did for Braith Hut. So this is January 22nd, and Bill's already talked. It's described that he is working with several people. And of course, this is from Sam Schumacher to Bill Wilson. It's interesting because we think Bill Wilson was working at Walter J. Fahey's and Company at this time frame. But again, it's quite just a remarkable. Again, now we do know that Bill, with working with Fred B., he shared his own story again a week or two after being released from Towns Hospital from December 18th. So it was late December, early January that he was had success with Mr. Fred here. In fact, Fred Braithhead is described in several different fashions, but this is just a nerd factor of about 9. As you can see, all descriptions through Stepping Stones has him as a chemistry professor, and this kind of proves it. Again, Frederick Braithhead from New York, and of course, he is a actual chemistry professor. In fact, when you go into Brooklyn College, there he is right there. He actually had a high position, but that was Fred Braithhut, one of the first people that Bill Wilson worked with. We know that he never joined Alcoholics Anonymous. We do know that he did kind of stay in the fringes of the Oxford group and Calvary Church. And what's really fascinating is, and I don't have that and I can't show it to you, but we have the documentation. He actually bought a Works Publishing stock certificate back in when it was first started. But what's really interesting is he's actually mentioned in the Calvary Evangel. In fact, it's listed that William G. Wilson sponsored as godfather for baptism Frederick A. Braithhut on March 14th. And of course, this is April 31st. And if you look in the paragraph right there, it says communion. So communion into the Calvary Church was Florence Braithhut and Frederick E. Braithhut. So I thought that was pretty interesting. There's another name that's noteworthy in this list of people who joined officially. And down there at the bottom is, of course, Edwin T. Thatcher. He also joined at the same time. He was described as being sponsored in baptism from Francis Ship Cornell and a man by the name of Taylor Tex Francisco, who was actually in charge of Calvary Mission at that point. He was the general manager. It was Taylor Tex Francisco and, of course, Sam Schumacher. And Taylor had taken over by a man by the name of S.A. Hadley, and pretty fascinating, or H.H. Hadley, Henry Hadley Jr. But again, we know Fred never joined Alcoholics Anonymous, but described as being, disheartened that Bill had the 0% success rate, right? In the movie, My Name is Bill, it's pointed out that he leans over and he talks to his wife, Lois, and says, I'm not getting anybody sober. And Lois says, but Bill, you're sober. Now, it's described he also went to Towns Hospital and often, and there he talked to Dr. Silkworth. He did frequently. And of course, he shared with the doctor about all his failures. Now, this is another important date. This is where Bill, again, and our entire future fellowship were given a monumental, and I would underline, game-changing suggestion of the bottle, of the problem of the bottle. Both. In fact, it's described here in Pass It On, where he basically says, Bill, he says, no, Bill, you've got the cart before the horse. He's basically, they've been running him over with the religious teachings of the Oxford group, and nobody's getting sober. And he tells Bill, give them the medical business and give it to them hard. Pour it into them about the obsession that condemns them to drink and the physical sensitivity or allergy of the body that condemns them to go mad or die if they keep on drinking. from another alcoholic, one alcoholic talking to another, maybe that will crack those tough egos deep down. And what's interesting is almost that is described in the letter that Sam Shoemaker wrote to Bill Wilson, saying, "You can, you have the ability. They want what you've got to share." So I thought that was pretty interesting. Again, coming from the doctor. Now, this was the dawn of how to approach the still suffering alcoholic. Now, unknown exact of this date, but we know it was in 1935 and it was approaching the April-May timeframe. And of course, this will actually be proven successful. Now, Bill Wilson, again, saying that he was about ready to go on this trip, and this trip is going to Akron, Ohio. So a day later or so, Bill was offered the last real business opportunity that required him to travel to Akron, Ohio, to negotiate a proxy fight for a rubber company. And of course, he makes his way out west, and the company was National Rubber Machinery Company. And they got offices all over the place, but headquarters is in Akron, Ohio. And just to give you an idea of some of the stuff that they make, this is what the proxy fight was over. It's, they feed rubber into this thing and it heats it up, and out comes either a tire or a gasket. It's all kinds of it's a huge company, but this is what Bill was involved with. And of course, it's described that the proxy fight isn't going very well. In fact, some descriptions is it's crashing and burning in process. And at the time, Bill is staying here at the Mayflower Hotel. There's an older postcard, 1931. That's kind of what it looks like pretty recently. It's no longer a hotel. But in Bill's story, it's described that he's pacing the hotel lobby, kind of frantically. Now, on one side, it points to the description, and in Bill's story, he says that there is a bar with a gay crowd inside. And if you look at the sign there, it says the Parisian Bar, and of course, on the other side is a coffee shop, which is located literally right next to the phone. So, in Bill's head, and this is an early photograph from the Akron Summit County Archives of Mayflower Lobby. So this is pretty on point. And you can imagine Bill just kind of pacing, wondering, how am I going to make a living and support Lois? How am I going to, make a living? How am I going to pay my hotel bill? All these things. So again, option one was to go in and steal some vicarious action by having a couple of innocent glasses of ginger ale, whatever that means. Or option number two, picking up the phone, reaching out and touching someone. And of course, we know exactly, how, Bill felt at this time. He was alone. He was fearful. He realized he was in a dangerous situation, and it hits him. Find another drunk. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. He picked up the phone and, make a long story short, got in touch with Reverend Walter Tunks, who got in touch with Henrietta Seiberling, where he told her that I am a rum hound from New York and part of the Oxford group and need a drunk to talk to. And she's thinking, well, I've got the right person. She gets in touch with Ann Smith, and of course, through Ann Smith, gets in touch with Dr. Bob. It just so happened that on that particular day, Dr. Bob was a little passed out on the floor as described, and may not have been the right time, but a definite day, Mother's Day, May 12th, 1935, and the two met. Now, in short, again, speaking of Dr. Bob, he drank. In fact, he drank a lot. Now, just bringing you up to speed, in Dr. Bob's story, it's described for 32 years he didn't know what was wrong with him until Bill visited Akron. From the times described in 33 from Dr. Bob's nightmare, that's basically it in short. It says, during the subsequent 15 years, he had sense enough never to go to the hospital if he had been drinking. He did that for 15 years. And of course, I had to stay sober until during the day up to 4 o'clock. This routine went on with few interruptions for an additional 17 years. So Dr. Bob's been drinking almost from the beginning as well. Now, again, as it's described, it just so happens, that Dr. Bob had two children. They were known as Smitty and Sue, Susan and Robert Holbrook Smith Jr., but they called them Smitty and Sue. Now, it's described that Smitty was the one that drove Dr. Bob to meet this man from New York. Ann Smith was riding shotgun, and of course, Dr. Bob was in the back seat sporting a pretty healthy hangover. And of course, during that whole time, we know that they were heading here. Now, the interesting thing, again, Dr. Bob sporting this hefty hangover, basically the whole way was saying, I'm only going to give this guy 15 minutes. I am in a bad way. Whatever happens in 15 minutes, I don't care what goes on. You come in and you get me because I'm in bad shape. And of course, Ann's like, nodding, sure, I will, dear. Yeah, right. Like that's going to happen. Anyway, Bill ended up meeting with Dr. Bob, right? Bill approached Dr. Bob. One of the first thing he says is, you look like you could use a drink. And Dr. Bob kind of smirked and replied, look, Sonny Jim, I've been poked, prodded, lecturized, analyzed, therapized, hot rocks. I've done acupuncture, you name it. What can you tell me about my drinking? And Bill's response was interesting, and it's something that the doctor had never heard before. It says, I'm not here for your drinking. I'm here for my drinking. And of course, this was something that had intrigued Dr. Bob because pretty much he had never heard it before. And of course, the most amazing thing, and this is one of the another date that just, was a game changer. Bill followed Dr. Silkworth's advice, and for that 15-minute talk, turned into 6 hours. He didn't tell him about Dr. Bob's drinking. He talked about Bill's drinking. He talked about the problem. He talked about the obsession of the mind. He talked about the allergy of the body. Once I start thinking about this drinking, I cannot stop. And once I take any alcohol into my system whatsoever, it triggers that abnormal, unusual reaction. And of course, it's also described that Dr. Bob finally, for the first time, found somebody who knew all about the drinking game. In fact, he talked his language. Now, we know that from there, again, Bill was staying in Ohio and for a short period of time. But, the interaction, we're introducing these two people. This is Thomas Henry and his wife, Clarice Williams. And of course, they were members of the Oxford Group. Now, Slender Thread, the Oxford Group had been meeting in Akron since 1933. So Dr. Bob had been an active member of the Oxford Group for about a year prior to Bill coming. So they kind of had that up and running. And again, what are the odds that Oxford Group meeting centers around Dr. Bob and then Bill from New York just happens to come in? What are the odds of that? Again, this is just just a couple of photographs of the Oxford Group. There's one in February of 11th of 1934. We think this was the one where Dr. Bob started attending with his wife. They met here. Again, there was one major get-together in the Mayflower Hotel. The other one, this one's in October of 1934, and probably Dr. Bob didn't attend these, but this definitely shows that it supports his claim that he actually had been going, but he had been going intentionally to kind of get the heat off. So they have several things, and this is kind of a rabbit hole all into itself. This is a couple of newspapers about a gentleman who actually is responsible for the Oxford Group coming to Akron. And his name was Russell Firestone. He made his third step surrender on a train in front of Sam Schumacher. So, it's just an interesting slender thread. And of course, all of this, the Firestones attend the Oxford Group event, and basically they approach. But long story short, again, Ebby, had taught Bill the three components of this alcoholic puzzle. Bill was in possession of this, and he transferred it to Dr. Bob. And of course, another little tidbit of synchronicity, it just so happened that one of the chief engineers for the National Rubber Machinery was, of course, T. Henry, and he actually had a couple of patents there. So just an interesting little connection. Now, uh, at this time, Bill begins to write Lois again with his first initial interactions with Dr. Bob. He actually writes one May on Mayflower Hotel stationery. This is May 35, basically saying, "Darling, I love you much." Uh, as usual, poor in the correspondence, things have been happening at a perfectly furious rate, both in business and with respect to the group. And there had been two activities had been curiously and wonderfully interrelated. He's talking about the proxy fight and, of course, his interaction with the Oxford group there, both being under the same thing. And then he writes another one also in May of 1935, and this one's from just an example of from Portage Country Club letterhead, and he stayed there for about 2 weeks after a Mayflower. And of course, he wrote again, saying that, he didn't, Dr. Bob had kind of backslid a little bit. Interesting. They didn't have anyone who really understood alcoholics, and Bill decided to stay there, not only stay there, but he ended up moving in with Dr. Bob and stayed in the basement. He ended up staying at Dr. Bob's house on 855 Ardmore Avenue for about 3 months. Now, again, what's really interesting is in the forward to the second edition, it talks about the two men set to work almost frantically. And, just to throw some names out, there was a first mention of a prospect. Now, his name was Dr. Roy Heyman McKay. And of course, he actually wrote a letter from Dr. Bob Stationery to Lois. This is Bill to Lois, basically saying that they have started to work with a gentleman. That's a transcript of the letter, but he says, "Dr. Smith is helping me to change a Mr. McKay, once the most prominent surgeon in town, who lost everything, wife committed suicide. He is ostracized and on the brink of suicide himself. If his change accomplished, he would be the most powerful witness to the whole town, since his case is notorious." Now, of course, they attempted to help them, but they were still, this is that quote unquote flying blind period. What works, what doesn't. It's kind of a situation of what does this button do, and what works and what doesn't. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Roy Heyman McKay did not make it. In fact, he ended up passing away about 8 years later. There was a description of a second attempt. In fact, another attempt was referred to by a minister from the First Presbyterian Church by the name of J. Carroll Wright. His name was Edgar Riley. They called him Eddie R, or just Ed R. Now, what's interesting is, again, shortly after Bob, sobered in 35, neighbor of the Smiths, sent Edgar, known as Eddie, over to the Smiths home. Edgar and his wife, two children, were facing eviction at the time, and Ann Smith invited the family to stay with them and put them in Sue's bedroom. And of course, he was just described as definitely a devil-may-care chat. And there's just another early photograph of him. He was really young when he came into sobriety. But of course, as it turns out, things kind of didn't unfold that way. And there's just another little thing, but he ended up being quite a handful. In fact, it's described that he was in kind as an alcoholic atheist, able to produce a major crisis of some sort about every other day. I relate to that. Portrayed in an off-Broadway film, Bill and Dr. Bob, as a young father of two children, married to a scared, pregnant wife. And Ed became irrational and lost control when drinking. He was predictably violent, but when sober, seemed distant and depressed. And of course, Evie is mentioned in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers and Children of the Healer as the member who chased Anne around the house with a butcher knife. And of course, he was an early prospect who helped Bill and Dr. Bob learn the do's and don'ts in working with others. And I can literally see Dr. Bob leaning over to Bill saying, geez, let's not do that again. That doesn't help anybody. He missed the chance to be AA number 3, but he actually relapsed, had to be committed, but he reappeared later on in 1949. There's a stamp of him receiving a book from Sister Ignatia upon his release from St. Thomas Hospital. And he is attended Dr. Bob's funeral in 1950, and of course was sober and was a member of the Youngstown, Ohio group. And I didn't know I had that in there, but there's actual the book that Sister Ignatia had signed over. So what's interesting, again, when you put this in perspective, you had two people. One definitely did not make it and ended up passing away, falling down a flight of stairs. The other one did not get it in first, but again, seeds were planted. And of course, just an interesting thing. And Eddie did actually come back. In fact, he not only took sobriety by the horns, but he took it and ran with it. In fact, he headed the committee on alcoholism for Youngstown. And of course, that's just an interesting description there. So when you think about, Bill and Dr. Bob working with people, they had one failure. They had one definitely that falls into the category of showed improvement. And here's, I think we were talking about this earlier. Dr. Bob, again, with his compassion for cars. Here's just a young, here he is young, not sure exactly the context of this, but again, after they had been, again, I'm not sure where that is, but one of the things, again, Dr. Bob, after that interaction with Dr. McKay and Edgar Riley, it refers to this kind of slip for Dr. Bob. Now, Dr. Bob had a famous trip to Atlantic City for the American Medical Association. He joined something called the American Society of Colon and Rectal Surgeons Conference, which was actually part of the AMA. It was meeting at the same time. In fact, this is him becoming a member in 1929. And this is, again, when you look at this particular photograph, he kind of, well, he sticks out. He's basically the center guy, and you could see Dr. Bob clearly. But this brings us June into July. And of course, all in this time frame, Dr. Bob, again, after meeting the man who knew all about the drinking game, at this point, he has done everything that his earliest word of mouth program shared between the two. Again, joyful enthusiasm, except he would not do one thing. And we all kind of know it's one of the most pivotal parts of this program. He was in great fear that if he went around town setting right all the wrongs he did by making amends, he thought that as a physician, he would be finished professionally and lose his practice. In fact, he was the only proctologist listed on staff at City Hospital. And he was also one of the only ones that could practice in St. Thomas Hospital. So again, according to the book, he described it as the following: why, he argued, should he lose the remainder of his business only to bring more suffering to his family by foolishly admitting his plight to people for whom he made his livelihood? He would do anything but that. So in short, no amends, and of course, not yet. Now, when we look at this particular day, again, June 10th through June 14th, Dr. Bob decides to take this trip because he's definitely needed. And he travels to Atlantic City to be part of the American Medical Association, Canadian Medical Association, same thing, annual 86th annual session. Now, as it's described on his way up, and these are just some of the notes. This is from Comes of Age or Children. So he, Dr. Bob, went to Atlantic City Medical Convention, and nothing was heard from him for several days. Dr. Bob in the Good Old Timer says Dr. Bob began drinking as he boarded the train to Atlantic City. On arrival, he bought several quarts on his way to the hotel. That was Sunday night. He stayed sober Monday until after dinner on Tuesday. Dr. Bob started drinking in the morning and checked out of the hotel blackout. Next thing he knew, he was in the home of his nurse. The blackout was certainly more than 24 hours. Bill and Ann had waited for 5 days from the time Bob boarded the train to when they heard from the nurse in Cuyahoga Falls, who had picked him up that morning at the Akron Railroad Station. And verbal accounts from Bill and Ann Sue Smith. There was a 3-day sobering up period. Upon Dr. Bob's return, they had discovered he was due to perform surgery 3 days later. At 4 o'clock in the morning of the operation, Dr. Bob said, "I'm going to go through with this." Bill and Ann drove Dr. Bob to City Hospital at 9 a.m., gave Dr. Bob a beer, and in the video, Bill's own story, gave him a beer and a goofball. And of course, in the morning of the surgery, and the same is repeated in Pass It On and Not God. So when we take everything into account, again, for June, it looks like this. Sunday the 9th, started drinking on the train ride up to Atlantic City, New Jersey, bought several quarts and checked into an Atlantic City hotel. Monday, stayed sober until dinner. Tuesday, started drinking in the morning, later checked out of the hotel. Wednesday, at some point, there was a blackout that was likely longer than 24 hours. Thursday, there's some form of a time warp here. And of course, he comes to Friday. He was picked up by his nurse in the morning at the train station in Ohio. Then, of course, picked up by Ann and Bill at that nurse's house 5 days after leaving, starting day one of a 3-day drying out period with Bill. Saturday was day two of the drying out. Sunday was day three. And of course, Monday morning, Dr. Bob scheduled surgery where he gave him a beer as well as a goofball. Now, here's the note. After the surgery, Dr. Bob pulled another little disappearing act. And this is kind of what set this date ahead of all others. Dr. Smith was, in fact, going around Akron making those amends that he would not make before. And of course, this was the day of his last drink. The note here is the date discrepancy does not matter, whether it's June 10th, June 17th, June 13th, or whatever. It's just the action. But since it's pretty much well established, June 10th, Founders Day, this was a listing in Time Magazine's 80 Days That Changed the World. And that kind of brings us up to this point in time. But from here, again, the work must continue. And again, June 28th, 1935, Dr. Bob had thought of a great place they might find prospects desperate enough to really want what they could. It was his old stomping grounds, Akron City Hospital. In fact, most of his practice was at this particular hospital. Here's just an early photograph. This was him all the way back in med school in as early as 1910. So he has been around since pretty much the beginning. And he basically, that was him with the rest of the interns. Here he is with interns and a physician's assistant, also all out of Akron City Hospital. Same thing here. Again, he was listed as the only proctologist, colon surgeon at the city hospital. And of course, he had a practice at the Second National Bank building. And fun fact, when Bill first arrived and stayed at Mayflower Hotel, Dr. Bob's office was literally a block from the Mayflower Hotel. So they were pretty much within sight of each other. And also, again, one alcoholic could affect another. Is no non-alcoholic, and that strenuous work one alcoholic with another was vital to permanent recovery. Dr. Bob, it says the two men sent to work, again, almost frantically. In their very first case, a desperate run, we covered immediately and became known as AA number 3. And of course, his name was Bill D. Now, having had the experience of going around and making those amends and truly feeling the result of making those amends, that is some of the stuff that they were able to bring. Dr. Bob again, called his practicing hospital, asked if, talked to a Mrs. Hall, asked if there was anyone there that they could visit who were victims of the bottle. And of course, he and a man from New York might have a cure to alcoholism. Of course, yes, there was a lawyer. Mrs. Hall stated, have you tried this cure on yourself? And of course, Dr. Bob, kind of laughing, said, put him in a private room and we will be right down. And of course, that's the story. Bill Dotson, they approached him and, started talking. His wife said that there were two men that may have a cure for alcoholism if he cared to see him. And Bill Dotson actually was kind of upset at first, thought his wife sold him out. But once he learned that they were ex-alcoholics as well, he was basically was, allowed them in. And of course, that kind of takes this particular point with, the man on the bed. It's kind of inaccurate. There was actually Edgar Riley was still bouncing in and around during this time frame, but the point is Dr. Bob and Bill visiting Bill Dotson when Bill Dotson was released on July 4th. Just another interesting thing happened, and of course, this was the first group formed that no one realized it at the time. July 4th, the day when Dr. Bob was released from the hospital. They didn't go to the hotel. They didn't go out for a steak dinner. They basically went to an actual group house meeting at Thomas Henry and Clarice Williams on 767 Palisades Drive. And of course, everybody was there, mainly T. Henry and Clarice Williams, Henrietta Seiberling, and Smith, and went from there. So at this point, what they knew all three parts. They knew the practical program of action, the spiritualist solution, and of course, the problem, the obsessional mind and the allergy of the body. July 4th, all took place here. The drunk squad of the Oxford group could be described as the beginning. Home at T. Henry and Clarice Williams, Henrietta Seiberling, Anne and Dr. Bob were there. Of course, Bill, and here's the thing, Lois was actually visiting for 2 weeks to see Bill and his enthusiasm with finally getting people sober. And of course, Bill and his wife, Henrietta Dotson, who had just been released. And of course, there's Edgar Riley. And that is another very interesting, important date, July 4th of 1935, which ironically, if we look at this in a celebratory fashion, that is in about 2 days. So pretty interesting there. And of course, can't leave pretty much. I'm running just a wee bit over, but we're looking at AA number 3. AA number 4, basically the 7-month slip. That's a typo right there. But his name was Ernie William Galbraith. And of course, he was another devil-may-care chap. In short, Ernie's parents, through their church, heard the news, got in touch with Dr. Bob and Bill. And of course, Ernie joined the fray. There's just an just because we have it, but if you look at Ernie, he is definitely he is the one that's kind of all the way off to the right on that particular. But there he is as a young lad. He was an incredibly old-looking guy for a young age. In fact, that's young Ernie sitting with his grandfather. So there's Archibald, and of course Ernie. Ernie got into the army early. He ran he did deliveries with truck driving. And of course, he ended up getting it. Long story short, and this is awkward, Ernie again relapsed in 35 and of course came back in appropriately, earning the title 7-month slip. He stayed sober and later into the 30s, into the 40s, and of course ended up marrying Dr. Bob's daughter. So that must have been kind of an interesting change, but there he is again. They had 2 children, and of course, looking at Mickey and Bona, the 2 grandsons of Dr. Bob. So Dr. Bob had some grandsons, pretty interesting. And of course, there's just some other photographs as well as that. But just a weird situation that Sue was actually almost about 10 years younger than Ernie, so that was definitely an awkward situation. But when it really boils down to it, again, we look at another debt of gratitude. People are starting to get sober. All of this is starting to take place at the home of T. Henry and Clarice Williams. They opened up their home and kept it going. And by August of 1935, Bill actually leaves Ohio, goes back to New York. Again, talks about with Dr. Silkworth, people are actually getting this thing. Ebby Thatcher will actually move in with Bill and Lois in that time frame, and of course, just going from there. So when we look at it in terms of this whole entire thing, we're looking at the AA group number 2 actually forming, and of course, this was in August of 1935. So pretty amazing things. And again, there's no book yet, but there have the Dr. Silkworth's approach. They have the program of action and they have the solution. And from there, just a couple of people that immediately got sober in New York. We have Hank Parkhurst, New York #2, AA #6. We got Hank Parkhurst, John, as that's not Hank Parkhurst. That should say John Henry Fitzhugh, but it doesn't. And of course, AA #4, New York, and his name was Silas Bent. But pretty interesting that it goes from there. So you actually have Alcoholics Anonymous taking launch. And I think that is pretty much a good place to stop. And I thank you for allowing me to share.
Yeah, my name's Bob. I'm an alcoholic. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks everyone for your service and joining us. Yeah, that was wonderful, Drew. You know what? Now you all know what a Sunday afternoon is like, because this is what we do on a Sunday afternoon. I think we'll bring it to a close. And Drew, would you like to lead us out with a serenity prayer? If everyone would like to unmute and just join us.
Sounds like a plan. Absolutely. All right. God.
God.
God, serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can,
To know the
and
difference.
wisdom to know the difference.
Thank you so much, Drew.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks for
Absolutely wonderful.
I'll send it.